is where we're heading, and I don't think I clarified this very well when we went through kind of the timeline, is that after adolescence, roughly, we have the major tasks of either role or identity or role confusion, and that was the major task at that time. That was usually the time when a lot of crises tend to happen because we're trying to resolve that issue. Where do we fit in the world, who we are, how that fits with everybody else that's in the world with us, all of those sorts of things. If we get through that, then because of that crisis, then the next tasks that confront us is isolation versus intimacy. I don't think it's any coincidence that Erickson discovered the fact that in young adulthood is when that issue becomes a bigger issue. The nature of what we go into, once we get resolved in a sense, who we are, then the next question is who we are relative to somebody significant in terms of intimacy and understanding. So truth matters because how can I be known if I make it possible for the other person to know me? Pure glass makes it possible for us to look in. We have the responsibility to have blinds over our hearts to be able to determine who is going to look in and who isn't. But there is always going to be a divergence of paths from those people that kind of live with the role confusion and continue in that, and therefore make a commitment to continue the stained glass life. And that doesn't mean that other crises can't occur at some later point in time. They can, but in large measure, even this, and we pointed this out, even in the culture that we're in, it really encourages us to live that life. Is I will live my life, you accept my stained glass, and I'll accept yours. And we'll stay safely behind it. From there we went into then what kind of motivates it? What is the shame that hangs all of it together? Of course, in a stained glass, it's lead. The lead is symbolic of the shame that we have that holds all of these pieces of unwanted identities together. And we looked at 3 different strategies for protection: moving away, moving toward, and moving against. And that was really where we landed. After that, then, we say, all right, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we survived this crisis. And we begin to make the conclusion that indeed I want to move toward becoming a pure glass person. What exactly does it look like? And we looked at the dimensions of the pyramid that I mentioned to you in terms of truth and control and boundaries and forgiveness and conflict and intimacy. And those 6 are really the building blocks on which we begin to become the pure glass people that we want to be. So where we left off was talking about what does truth have to do with it. We divided it up into big T and little t truth. Now remember, I mentioned this last time. This is a convenient designation, but these 2 things together are all of our life. Okay? They're not separate. They interact, they do, but that's all of our life is big T and little t. And we looked at this idea of where they intersect between the vertical of big T truth that anchors us to who we are in Christ, anchors us to our identity in Christ, anchors us to who God says we are, how God says the world should work in terms of relationships. All of those things are big T truth. The little t world is where I live, which is ironically the horizontal. And where those things intersect, what I refer to here as the messy middle, is really where the abundant life is lived, because we live on the edge of trust. We live on the edge of risk. We live on the edge of the things that we tend to try to minimize in our lives. Is it any wonder that our lives end up becoming more and more sterile the more and more committed we become to averting risk and averting trust? It's little wonder at all. And it's ironic that the church actually lands there, and even the relationships within the church land there, is we love to talk about things that are true, but we forget about the fact that we need to live them. And so that's where the risk and trust come in. So we looked at big T and little t truth and the interaction between these two. In a lot of cases, for people that are really good at big T truth, their tendency is to live along here, and then when they intersect with somebody who really is living in the little t, where they feel all these things, they're confused by all these things, and the big T people love to sit up on their high horse and say, come on over here, do the right thing, and everything will be fine. Instead of traveling down and meeting the person where they are and journeying with them back to the intersection. And that's what's missing. That's what's missing in a lot of our relationships. We depend way, way, way too much on propositional truth. In other words, the truth I can tell you about rather than experiential truth, living with you in it. Which brings us to two other dimensions. We got big T and little t truth. There's another kind of propositional change that I want to make. And the first one is having to do with living in the truth versus living with the truth. Now, we've already played with prepositions and boundaries. And in spite of the fact that you guys got the 101 version, the 201 version is coming, but we played with the prepositions there. Being responsible to somebody versus being responsible for someone. Well, in this case, it's living in the truth versus living with the truth. And living in the truth is captured in the Psalm 15. It's one of the shortest Psalms, but it is jam-packed with a lot of really important intersectory truths. I just made up a word. How about that? Intersection truths between little t and big T truth. It's living in the truth. And so what David says at the very end, this is the punchline. O Lord, who may abide in your tent, who may dwell in your holy hill. This is the epitome of intimacy. When somebody went into someone to know them in Old Testament times, it was intimacy. All of intimacy, not just sexual intimacy, all of intimacy. So it says, who can experience this kind of intimacy? He who walks with integrity. What is integrity? It's living integrated. It comes from the same word. Integrated is pure glass. It's being known and knowing another. And being capable of being known. So walks with integrity and works righteousness. This does not mean being perfect in every way, like Mary Poppins. This has nothing to do with it. It has everything to do with the nature of my relationships with God and others. Righteousness is not perfection. Righteousness is being rightly related. That's what it really means. So working at being rightly related to the people that I am in community with and being rightly related with God. Remember, this is the intersection of big T and little t truth. And finally, speaks truth in his heart. Living in the truth is different than espousing the truth. Living in the truth is actually immersing ourselves in it, no matter how uncomfortable it might become. So living in the truth is one dimension of this stuff. The second dimension is living with it. And living with the truth is what I call the heart of acceptance. Living with the truth of who you are and who I am is the essence of moving toward becoming pure glass people. I can't give away, and I said this in the boundary stuff, and I'll say it again, and you'll hear me say it again probably before the semester is out. You cannot give away that which you don't own. And you can't own something that you won't accept. You can't. So, living with the truth of you and living with the truth of me is the heart of acceptance. And Paul says it in Romans 15. I want to give you the whole context because we jump to the conclusion. Therefore, accept one another as Christ has accepted you. But we've got to understand what are the conditions of this. And it's really important because when you look at it, it says, we who are strong must be considerate of those who are sensitive about things like this. We must not just please ourselves. We should help others do what is right and build them up in the Lord. This is all the relational context of accepting another. Therefore, and you always have to ask what it's there for. And it's the conclusion, it's the punchline. So we live with each other, we're considerate of each other, we build one another up. Therefore, accept one another as Christ has accepted you. We might be willing to accept someone else that way, but we're sure not willing to accept ourselves that way. And that's oftentimes why we grind our gears at trying to change. Grace is the only thing that will lubricate those gears for us to make the kind of change we want. It's the only thing. Shame will trap us in a prison of never being good enough. Grace says, try. Try. And try again, and learn again, and all of the things that go along with that. So, to make this point to you, how many of you guys are familiar with the Serenity Prayer? Anybody can recite the first 4 lines? Here's your challenge.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Okay. That is only 4 lines of a very long prayer that most people have never seen. And it looks like this. What Anna gave us, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Period. No, it's not a period. It continues. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace. We're going to talk more about that later today. Because we see hardships as an indication of the loss of peace, rather than part of the journey toward peace. It goes on, and this is the punchline, folks. Taking as he did, speaking of Jesus, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Think for a moment what it took for Jesus to come here and live amongst us. He knew absolutely perfection in every way, in a place of no wants, no desires, no needs, no problems, no relationship issues at all, and then he inserts himself into human relationships. The only way that he can have any relationship with us at all is because he accepts us as we are. Trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever and ever in the next. Sounds a little different now, right? Those first 4 lines end up being in a very different context when we see it within the context of the entire prayer. It was written by a theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. So, let me end this section with a quote from Brennan that you will read in the Ragamuffin Gospel. He says this: once we accept the gospel of grace and seek to shed the defense mechanisms and disguises, honesty becomes more difficult and more important. You've been experiencing that, right? More difficult, and you get a sense of how much more important it becomes. Now, honesty involves the willingness to face the truth of who we are as we are, I might add, regardless of how threatening or unpleasant our perceptions may be. It means hanging in there with ourselves, otherwise known as grace, and with God, learning our mind tricks by experiencing how they defeat us, recognizing our avoidances, acknowledging our lapses, learning completely that we cannot handle it ourselves. This steady self-confrontation requires strength and courage. We cannot use failure as an excuse for not trying. Learning our mind tricks by experiencing how they defeat us. He's calling us to be students of ourselves. To know ourselves. You can't know that stuff if you don't look. Better yet, you can't know that stuff if you refuse to accept it. Brennan was the poster child for this very thing. He lived and made mistakes and fell ended up in Skid Row in Fort Lauderdale, and then ended up in Hazelden at the alcohol rehab center. All of it. He was that. He lived this out. And the longer you were around him and heard him talk about life, it was a wonder that he was still alive at all. And he understood that. Because he was willing to look inside and look at the demons that were part of him and say, gotcha. He actually wrote a letter to himself. He referred to it as the imposter in Abba's Child. And he wrote a letter to the imposter and actually recognized that the imposter in him, you might say the stained glass in him, played a very important role for his survival. But the letter ended with, but I don't need you as much as I did before. You played a vital role, acceptance. Now I'm charting another path. And that's really ultimately what we're called to. So, where do we head from here? Now that we've established what we do with truth and how we understand truth and how we live in it versus with it, sometimes we'll live in it, we'll reject the with part. Where we go is this, the scourge of control. Now, when we talked about the pyramid and looked at it, we understood that the truth has to be the base. Everything can't be built on sand. It has to be built on solid rock of the truth. And not only the truth of what God has given us, but also the truth of who we are. So, in order to sensitize you to what I am about to teach you, I have a little assessment device that allows you the opportunity to see where you are in regards to this particular topic.